Okay, hello everyone. We're back. I haven't recorded in a few weeks because I was on spring break, but we're going to finish up the New Deal finally today. Here is the reading, and here are the key terms. I will leave a link in the cards to the online version of the textbook. And here are the guiding questions for today. Just to note, this is the second New Deal that we're talking about. If you haven't checked out the videos on the first New Deal, make sure you do those for context. And we're also going to look at the New Deal's legacy. So, again, we're looking at kind of the shifting relationship between Americans and their government in terms of the response to the New Deal. And then we'll also look at some of the critiques to the New Deal, both from the left and from the right. And we should definitely think about why the New Deal still matters to today. So we'll finish up with that. So let's talk about some broad challenges to the New Deal. It did start to push to the left as FDR's second administration began. And as the New Deal programs continue, the critiques come from both the left and the right. So on the rightward side, the critique was generally that the New Deal was socialistic in nature. And the Supreme Court at the time was rather conservative, and FDR complained about them quite frequently. He was known to have called them nine old men. And his problem with the Supreme Court was that they struck down aspects of key New Deal programs. It struck down the Agricultural Adjustment Act and also the National Recovery Act. And FDR's response to this was to pack the court with more liberal minded justices that would uphold his programs. And the court packing plan failed in practice, but the rhetoric itself led the Supreme Court to uphold key facets of New Deal programs in order to preserve the makeup of the court at the time. So, just to go into a little bit more detail about court packing, this was introduced via legislation. And what it said was that the president could appoint a new judge for every Supreme Court member over the age of 70 and a half. And I find that interesting given that the Constitution does not state anything about age under Article 3, which describes the judicial branch. And also, this law would have increased the Supreme Court to a maximum of 15 members, which is a great leap considering that the Supreme Court at that time had 9 members. And the court packing plan was soundly defeated, and it also caused FDR to lose political support. And even though the court packing battle ultimately ended, there were some very important left leaning New Deal programs that remained intact. And the most important one, I would argue, was Social Security, and we'll get into that in more detail in just a little bit. There were also critics from the left. So Upton Sinclair, you might remember him as the author of the book The Jungle during the Progressive Era. He ran for governor in 1934 in California, and it was a very close race. He did lose. But his platform was for a government-run production system. And then also Francis Townsend, a former doctor and public health official from California, called to provide $200 monthly to all citizens over the age of 60. So, sort of a modified version of Social Security. Huey Long, who had been governor of Louisiana and at that point was a senator from Louisiana, authored the Share Our Wealth program, which was designed to redistribute wealth amongst American citizens. And Huey Long was assassinated in 1936, and there was a conversation about him possibly running as a third party candidate against FDR in the 1936 election. So that challenge obviously ended when Huey Long was killed. But it's just interesting to see that in some parts of the country, socialism were taking hold again. And there were other critics, civilian critics from the right. There was Reverend Charles Coughlin, who was a radio personality from Michigan, and he was made famous for his attacks on FDR as being too leftward leaning in his social program. So I find quite a lot of this to be quite interesting in its connections to the present day. We have plenty of radio hosts at this point, both on the left and the right, who are very famous personalities, and people sort of religiously tune into the programming for political commentary. And we also are seeing some interesting resurgences of socialist policies in all levels of government throughout the country. So quite interesting stuff. So in 1936, despite all of the challenges that FDR faced, he was soundly reelected, and this gave him a clear mandate to make a more radical and leftward leaning approach towards tackling poverty. And it also laid the foundation for many social welfare programs that still exist today. And so in 1935, the National Labor Relations Act, also known as the Wagner Act, offered federal legal protection to labor unions. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act established the first federal minimum wage. There were also changes to the tax policy during this period that made more of a progressive income tax system. And this had initially started with the ratification of the 16th Amendment during the Progressive Era. It was just codified during this time. There were other labor-friendly policies that allowed for more substantial labor unions to collectively bargain with their employers on a large-scale level. And Social Security was arguably the most significant elderly poverty reduction program in U.S. history. What Social Security was a pension program for senior citizens, and it was a contributory payroll tax, which means that that tax is taken directly out of individuals' paychecks. And it's also a benefit that is paid out in proportion to the amount a worker pays in. And despite its high cost, Social Security is still immensely popular across the ideological spectrum. It has become increasingly difficult to finance, however, as the baby boomer generation reaches retirement age. It's important to touch upon the New Deal and race before we close out. Now, FDR was not particularly vocal about acute problems that non-white Americans faced during the Great Depression. He was worried that saying such would antagonize pro-Jim Crow Southern Democrats. Let's consider previous examples of some New Deal programs like the AAA that actually exacerbated conditions for Black Americans. In some ways, though, FDR did cave to some of the racist sentiments of the time. So he removed domestic workers from Social Security eligibility, which had a disproportionately negative impact on Black women, rendering them ineligible to save for the retirement. And there was a stigma amongst some whites that Social Security would pay for idleness. And it was tied up with the sentiments surrounding previous efforts to punish the Black community, such as vagrancy laws. So again, there's just sort of racism embedded in that policy. FDR did, however, bring some representation into his administration by appointing the first woman to a cabinet position. That was Frances Perkins as the first female Secretary of Labor, and also a Black woman to advise the National Youth Administration. That was Mary McLeod Bethune. So she was the first Black woman ever to serve in any sort of administrative position in the federal government. And the broad structure of the New Deal still operated under the traditional male breadwinner system. So women were still generally limited to more feminine expectations, which also meant that they were denied certain New Deal benefits. Now, a big question here for us is whether or not the New Deal pulled the U.S. out of the Depression. So economists typically argue that World War II was really what economically pulled the U.S. out of the Depression, but the New Deal programs themselves provided crucial, even if it was temporary, relief to individuals. The financial sector also very much needed that emergency relief, many economists argued, because it helped stabilize the rest of the economy. But attempts to cut spending in 1937 triggered an economic recession. Because of the timing there, it's difficult to fully gauge whether or not the economy was stable enough to behave without all of these crucial props in place. Now, the New Deal also popularized an economic system called Keynesian economics, which was named after John Maynard Keynes, which emphasized government spending to help improve the economy. That is opposed to supply-side economics, which becomes nicknamed Reaganomics in the 1980s. And that economic belief calls for a reduction of government spending and low taxes. Many social issues, particularly racial inequities, remain largely unaddressed until after World War II. So here are the guiding questions. Yet again, I hope that these helped answer some of your questions just broadly about the New Deal. Again, the legacy itself is very interesting. We did examine some of the some of the things like Social Security and a minimum wage that still exists, and also just generally some of the critiques behind the New Deal and the discussion of policies like court packing all have very tangible connections to political debates of the day. So that's it for the New Deal, and we'll pick back up soon with World War II. Thanks so much for watching, and take care.